When David called me just a housewife in front of his colleagues at the annual Pine Valley Medical Center holiday party, I smiled politely and excused myself to the restroom. What he didn't know was that while he was earning his $180,000 administrator salary, the useless housewife he'd just humiliated had quietly built a portfolio worth $52 million. The silk clutch in my hands contained a single bank statement that would change everything, but I wasn't ready to use it yet. Sometimes the sweetest revenge requires perfect timing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The humiliation happened on a Friday night in December, the kind of crisp Pacific Northwest evening where the holiday lights reflected off wet pavement and everyone pretended their marriages were as perfect as their Instagram posts. I stood in the marble bathroom of the Riverside Country Club, staring at my reflection while David's words echoed in my mind like a slap that kept stinging. It had started innocently enough. Dr. Patricia Vance, the new chief of surgery, had been discussing the hospital's digital transformation initiative when she turned to me with genuine interest. "Claire, didn't David mention you have a background in technology? We could really use some insight from someone who understands both the medical field and tech innovation." I'd opened my mouth to respond, excited to finally contribute something meaningful to one of these endless medical social events, when David's hand landed possessively on my shoulder. His laugh carried that particular tone I'd grown to recognize over our 12 years of marriage, the one that meant he was about to say something that would make me feel small. "Oh, Patricia, Claire's been out of the tech world for over a decade. She's just a housewife now, takes care of the house and kids. Not much call for coding skills when you're planning carpools and organizing school fundraisers." His smile was indulgent, paternal, as if I were a child playing dress-up in adult conversation. "Though she does make an excellent chicken casserole for the hospital potlucks." The table had gone quiet in that particular way that happens when someone says something so dismissive that everyone else feels uncomfortable. Dr. Vance's eyebrows had raised slightly, and I caught the exchange of glances between the other wives present. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed relieved it wasn't them being publicly diminished by their spouse. "I see," Dr. Vance had said slowly, her tone carefully neutral. "Well, Claire, if you ever want to chat about the intersection of healthcare and technology, I'd be interested in your perspective. Sometimes fresh eyes see solutions that those of us too deep in the system miss." David had squeezed my shoulder harder, a warning disguised as affection. "That's very kind of you, Patricia, but Claire's got her hands full with Jake and Sophie's activities. Don't you, honey?" I'd nodded and smiled, playing the role I'd perfected over the years. The supportive wife. The woman whose dreams had been voluntarily set aside for the greater good of family harmony. The person whose identity had been so thoroughly subsumed into David's wife and the kids' mom that I sometimes forgot I'd once been Claire Morrison, the 24-year-old MIT graduate who'd walked away from a promising career at a tech startup to follow David to Seattle when he got his hospital administration position. Now, standing in the country club restroom, I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app I checked obsessively but never discussed. The numbers stared back at me in stark black digits. $52,847,293.47. $52,847,293.47. Money that David didn't know existed. Money that had grown from a $20,000 cryptocurrency investment I'd made secretly 7 years ago, followed by a series of tech startup investments that had paid off beyond my wildest dreams. The irony wasn't lost on me. While David had been dismissing my outdated tech knowledge, I'd been quietly building a fortune that dwarfed his lifetime earning potential. While he complained about my spending at Target and questioned every grocery bill, I'd been managing a portfolio that could buy the entire Pine Valley Medical Center twice over. I thought back to how it all started. Sophie had been 3, Jake was 5, and I'd been drowning in the monotony of endless laundry cycles, cartoon marathons, and conversations that never progressed beyond discussing David's work schedule or the children's activities. I loved my kids fiercely, but I was disappearing as a person, becoming nothing more than a facilitator of everyone else's life. It was during one of those long afternoon naps, while the kids were finally quiet, and David was at his usual emergency budget meeting that somehow always ran until 10 p.m., that I'd started researching cryptocurrency. Not because I thought I'd make money, but because I missed the mental stimulation of understanding complex systems, of seeing patterns and possibilities that others overlooked. Bitcoin was trading at around $8,000 then, seemingly expensive, but showing interesting technical indicators that reminded me of stock patterns I'd studied in my college economics classes. I'd taken $20,000 from an old 401k account I'd rolled over from my brief pre-marriage career, money David had forgotten existed, and bought cryptocurrency through an exchange I'd researched for weeks. Within 6 months, that investment had tripled. Instead of cashing out, I'd started studying blockchain technology with the same intensity I'd once applied to my MIT coursework. Late nights after David fell asleep, early mornings before the kids woke up, stolen hours during their activities became my secret education time. I learned about smart contracts, decentralized finance, and emerging altcoins that most investors had never heard of. I understood the technology in ways that pure financial investors didn't, could read white papers and evaluate the actual innovation behind the marketing hype. When Ethereum was still under $200, I moved half my Bitcoin profits into it. When Solana launched, I was there. When various DeFi protocols emerged, I understood their potential before mainstream adoption. But the real money had come from startup investments. My cryptocurrency gains had given me the capital to become an angel investor, and my tech background helped me identify promising companies before they became obvious opportunities. I'd invested early in 3 companies that were eventually acquired by major tech giants, turning my initial crypto profits into generational wealth. All of this I'd managed secretly, using a post office box for financial documents, conducting research during school hours, making investment decisions while David thought I was organizing playdates or volunteering at school functions. I'd become expert at hiding my intellectual engagement behind a facade of domestic contentment. The deception hadn't started maliciously. Initially, I'd planned to surprise David once my investments reached a significant amount, maybe $50,000 or $100,000. A nice nest egg that would make him proud, prove that his wife wasn't just a drain on the family finances. But as the money grew, so did my understanding of how David really viewed me. There were the casual dismissals, like tonight's public humiliation. The way he'd roll his eyes when I tried to contribute to conversations about current events or technology trends. His habit of explaining basic concepts to me that I understood better than he did. His assumption that my years at home had somehow erased my education and intelligence. There was the financial control that had crept in so gradually I'd barely noticed it becoming restrictive. David managed all our accounts, gave me a household allowance, questioned expenses over $50. He'd positioned himself as the financial expert of the family, despite the fact that his own investment portfolio consisted entirely of conservative mutual funds that barely beat inflation. Most painful were the social situations where he'd answer questions directed at me, or redirect conversations away from topics where I might have insight. I'd watch other couples where both partners contributed equally to discussions, where wives were treated as intellectual equals rather than attractive accessories, and I'd feel a growing resentment that I'd pushed down in the name of marital harmony. The money had become my secret proof that I was still the intelligent, capable person I'd once been. Every successful investment validated that my mind hadn't atrophied during the years of domestic focus. Every percentage point of portfolio growth was evidence that David was wrong about my capabilities. But the secrecy had also become a trap. How do you suddenly reveal that you've been deceiving your spouse about millions of dollars? How do you explain that you've been making major financial decisions without consultation, using money he didn't know existed? The longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine that conversation. Standing in the country club bathroom, listening to the muffled sounds of the holiday party continuing without me, I realized that tonight's humiliation had been the final straw. I was tired of being invisible in my own marriage, tired of pretending to be less than I was, tired of watching David take credit for our family's success while dismissing my contributions as insignificant. I walked back to our table with my head high, my smile perfectly composed. David was deep in conversation with Dr. Martinez about hospital budget allocations, gesturing expansively with his wine glass. He glanced up as I sat down, his expression mildly questioning, but didn't pause his monologue about cost-cutting measures and efficiency improvements. The key, he was saying, is understanding that healthcare is ultimately a business. You can't let emotions cloud financial decisions. Sometimes you have to make unpopular choices to maintain profitability. Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. It's a delicate balance, certainly. Though I imagine having a supportive family helps with the stress of those difficult decisions. David's hand found mine under the table, his thumb stroking across my knuckles in what others would interpret as affectionate connection. Absolutely. Claire keeps everything running smoothly at home so I can focus on the big picture at work. Division of labor, you know. She handles the domestic sphere, I handle the financial and professional sphere. It works well for us. I squeezed his hand back, my smile never wavering. It certainly does work well, I agreed softly. Sometimes people are surprised by how well things can work when everyone plays to their strengths. David beamed at me, pleased by what he interpreted as my public agreement with his characterization of our marriage. He had no idea that I was already planning how to upend every assumption he'd made about our division of labor and my place in his carefully ordered world.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The drive home was quiet, Jake and Sophie asleep in the back seat after being picked up from David's parents' house. David hummed along to classical music on the radio, occasionally commenting on conversations from the party. He seemed particularly pleased with himself, mentioning twice how well the evening had gone and how impressed Dr. Martinez had seemed with his budget proposals. I think there might be a promotion opportunity coming up, he said, as we turned into our neighborhood. Dr. Williams mentioned that they're looking for someone to head up the new efficiency initiative, could mean a significant salary increase. That's wonderful, I replied, watching the familiar houses of Maple Ridge Drive pass by our windows. Each house represented a family, couples who might or might not truly know each other, marriages that might be built on mutual respect or comfortable deception. I wondered how many other wives were living double lives, hiding pieces of themselves to maintain domestic peace. It would mean more travel, some longer hours initially, but the long-term benefits would be substantial. We could finally look at upgrading to one of those houses in the hills, maybe get a vacation place, build some real wealth for the kids' college funds. I nodded appropriately, thinking about the college funds I'd already established for Jake and Sophie, accounts worth enough to send them to any university in the world and still leave money for graduate school. David had been worried about affording in-state tuition. I'd already secured their entire educational future without him knowing it existed. At home, we went through our familiar routine. David checked his work emails while I got the kids settled in bed. Then we met in the kitchen where he poured himself a nightcap and I made tea. This was usually when we'd debrief from social events, discussing who had said what, and analyzing the political dynamics of David's workplace relationships. I thought tonight went really well, David said, settling into his favorite chair with his whiskey. Good networking opportunities, and I think I made a strong impression on several board members. Dr. Vance seemed very nice, I offered, testing the waters. David's expression shifted slightly. Oh, Patricia. Yes, she's competent enough, though she has some unrealistic ideas about technology integration. The board brought her in, thinking that her surgical background would help with implementing new systems, but there's a difference between using technology and understanding the business implications of technology adoption. She seemed interested in getting different perspectives on healthcare technology challenges. Well, she's new. She'll learn that most outside perspectives aren't particularly valuable when you're dealing with complex institutional systems. These aren't problems you can solve with Google searches and good intentions. He took a sip of his whiskey, then looked at me with what he probably thought was kindness. I hope you didn't feel awkward when she was asking about your tech background. I tried to redirect the conversation so you wouldn't feel pressured to discuss something you're not current on anymore. There it was again, that casual dismissal wrapped in protective concern. David genuinely believed he was being considerate by preventing me from embarrassing myself with outdated knowledge. He had no conception that his protection was actually condescension, that his assumptions about my capabilities were not only wrong but insulting. That was thoughtful of you, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. I just know how you sometimes feel self-conscious in those professional settings. There's nothing wrong with being focused on family instead of career. It's actually admirable, especially these days when everyone seems obsessed with professional achievement at the expense of personal relationships. He was warming to his theme now, the philosophical justification for why our marriage worked, why my sacrifices were actually noble choices, rather than limitations imposed by his expectations and my own conflict avoidance. Look at the Martinez family, he continued, both of them trying to maintain demanding careers, kids raised by nannies, never home for dinner. Sure, they're both successful professionally, but at what cost? Our kids know their parents. They have stability, routine, a mother who's available when they need her. That's worth more than any career achievement. I nodded and made appropriate murmuring sounds of agreement, while internally noting the irony that David's definition of available motherhood required my complete intellectual and financial invisibility. I could be the perfect mother and wife only by pretending that the ambitious, intelligent woman I'd once been had never existed. After David went to bed, I sat in my small home office, the room that he'd designated as Claire's space, for managing household paperwork and the children's school activities. The desk was covered with permission slips, volunteer schedules, and grocery lists, the visible evidence of my domestic management role. But hidden in a locked drawer was a second laptop, registered under my maiden name, that contained access to my real life. I opened my portfolio dashboard and reviewed the day's performance. My tech stocks had gained another $47,000 while I was being dismissed as just a housewife. My cryptocurrency holdings had appreciated by $32,000. In the 8 hours since David had publicly diminished my intelligence and relevance, my secret investments had earned more than his monthly salary. I opened a new document and began drafting a plan. Not for revenge, exactly, but for revelation. David's assumptions about our marriage, about my capabilities, about our financial future, were about to be comprehensively challenged. But it needed to be done carefully, strategically. Too dramatic, and it would seem vindictive. Too subtle, and the lesson would be lost. The opportunity would need to be perfect, the timing precise. I wanted David to understand, not just that he'd been wrong about my financial acumen, but that his entire framework for understanding our relationship was built on false assumptions. I wanted him to realize that while he'd been positioning himself as the provider and protector, I'd been quietly building a fortune that made his contributions irrelevant. But mostly I wanted him to feel the same confusion and diminishment that I'd experienced tonight when he'd dismissed me in front of his colleagues. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have your identity and capabilities casually erased by someone who claimed to love you. As I planned, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard earlier in the evening between Dr. Vance and another physician. They'd been discussing the hospital's financial challenges, the need for capital investment in new equipment, the ongoing struggle to balance patient care with economic sustainability. Dr. Vance had mentioned her frustration with the administration's conservative approach to technology adoption, their resistance to innovations that could improve both patient outcomes and operational efficiency. An idea began forming in my mind, a way to reveal my secret that would be both personally satisfying and potentially beneficial to others. What if my revelation could solve real problems while simultaneously proving David's assumptions wrong? What if I could demonstrate my financial capability in a context that highlighted exactly the kind of strategic thinking he'd claimed I lacked? I began researching Pine Valley Medical Center's financial structure, their recent budget reports, their capital needs. As someone married to a hospital administrator, I had access to more internal information than most potential investors. As someone with $50 million in liquid assets, I had the capability to make a real difference. By 3 a.m, I had the outline of a plan that would accomplish everything I wanted. It would reveal my financial secret in a way that was impossible to dismiss or minimize. It would demonstrate strategic thinking that David couldn't condescend to or explain away. And it would force him to reckon with the fact that his assumptions about our marriage dynamic were not just wrong but completely backwards. The hardest part would be waiting for the right moment. But I'd waited 12 years to be seen as an equal partner in my marriage. I could wait a little longer to ensure that when the revelation came, it would be absolutely perfect. The first sign that my plan was working came 3 weeks after the holiday party, when David stormed into the kitchen while I was packing Jake's lunch for his field trip to the Science Museum. His face carried that particular expression of controlled frustration that meant someone at work had challenged his authority. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice tight as he poured coffee into his travel mug with more force than necessary. Have you been discussing our personal finances with anyone? I continued spreading peanut butter on bread, keeping my movements steady and casual. What do you mean? Patricia Vance asked me yesterday if we'd be interested in participating in the hospital's new donor advisory committee. Apparently, someone suggested that we might have insights into strategic philanthropy and healthcare investment. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table, running his hand through his hair in the gesture that usually preceded his lectures about hospital politics. She seemed to think you might have relevant background experience. The beauty of small communities is how quickly information travels through unofficial channels. 3 weeks ago, I'd begun making discreet inquiries about Pine Valley Medical Center's expansion plans, reaching out to former MIT classmates who now worked in healthcare consulting, attending public board meetings that were technically open to community members but rarely drew outside attention. I'd asked thoughtful questions about equipment financing, technology integration challenges, and capital investment strategies. Word had apparently gotten back to Dr. Vance that someone in the community was showing sophisticated interest in the hospital's financial future. In a town like Millbrook Heights, where most major donors were either longtime local families or successful retirees, a younger person asking informed questions about healthcare economics would naturally draw attention. That's interesting, I said, wrapping Jake's sandwich in wax paper. What kind of committee work would it involve? David's irritation was palpable. It's not about the committee, Claire. It's about where she got the impression that you would have anything valuable to contribute to discussions about million-dollar capital campaigns. I told her you handle our household budget very competently, but that strategic philanthropy and healthcare investment are completely different skill sets. There it was again, that reflexive dismissal wrapped in faint praise. David's worldview required that I be competent within carefully defined domestic boundaries, while remaining helpless and irrelevant in areas he considered his professional domain. The idea that I might have independent expertise in financial strategy wasn't just wrong in his mind, it was impossible. What did Dr. Vance say to that? I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd responded to his condescension. She seemed surprised, actually. Said she'd gotten the impression from community members that you had a strong grasp of technology investment trends and healthcare innovation funding. David's frown deepened. I can't imagine where people would get that idea. I could have told him exactly where people were getting that idea. Over the past 3 weeks, I'd been systematically engaging with Millbrook Heights' professional community in ways that David never noticed because they happened during his work hours, and in contexts he didn't frequent. There was the conversation I'd had with Linda Martinez, the mayor's wife, at Sophie's piano recital. Linda served on the boards of 3 local nonprofits and had been frustrated by their inability to attract major donors for a community health initiative. When she'd mentioned the challenge of finding people who understood both healthcare needs and technology solutions, I'd been able to offer insights that clearly impressed her. I'd spoken with James Chen, who owned the largest accounting firm in town, while waiting for Jake during his soccer practice. James had been struggling to advise clients on cryptocurrency tax implications, and had been amazed by my detailed understanding of digital asset regulations. Our conversation had lasted over an hour, covering everything from DeFi protocols to NFT valuation strategies. Most significantly, I'd attended a public lecture at the community college about healthcare innovation, where I'd asked several questions that demonstrated deep familiarity with medical technology investment trends. Dr. Susan Walsh, who'd given the presentation, had approached me afterward, and we'd discussed the challenges facing rural hospitals trying to modernize their systems without adequate capital. In each case, I'd been careful not to reveal the extent of my financial resources, but I'd allowed my knowledge and analytical capabilities to show in ways they never could when David was present. Without him there to redirect conversations or explain my limitations, people responded to the intelligence and expertise I'd been hiding for over a decade. Maybe people remember that I used to work in technology, I suggested mildly, knowing this would provoke exactly the reaction I wanted. David's laugh carried that familiar edge of condescension. Claire, you worked at a tech startup for 18 months over 12 years ago. The technology sector has completely transformed since then. Blockchain, artificial intelligence, machine learning, cryptocurrency, all of these developments happened while you were focused on raising our children. There's nothing wrong with that choice, but let's be realistic about where your expertise actually lies. The irony was exquisite. David was lecturing me about technological developments that I'd not only followed closely but profited from extensively. My cryptocurrency portfolio alone contained assets he'd probably never heard of, and my understanding of blockchain technology was sophisticated enough that I'd served as an informal advisor to 2 startups that had later been acquired by major tech companies. You're probably right, I agreed, watching his shoulders relax as I appeared to accept his assessment. Though I do try to stay current by reading about new developments. That's admirable, and I'm sure you understand more than the average person. But there's a difference between reading articles and having the kind of deep expertise that would be valuable for hospital strategic planning. David checked his watch and stood up, clearly considering the matter settled. I'll tell Patricia that while we appreciate being considered, our involvement would be more appropriate in areas like event planning or volunteer coordination. After he left for work, I sat at the kitchen table with my own coffee and considered how perfectly David had demonstrated the very problem I was working to expose. He transformed Dr. Vance's recognition of my potential contributions into evidence of other people's misconceptions, then positioned himself as the authority who needed to correct those misconceptions on my behalf. David genuinely believed he was protecting me from embarrassment and protecting the hospital from my inadequate input. He couldn't conceive that his assumptions about my capabilities might be wrong because he'd constructed an entire identity around being the competent partner in our marriage. If I were actually knowledgeable about strategic financial matters, what would that make him? I opened my laptop and began researching Pine Valley Medical Center's most pressing capital needs. Their public financial reports showed a hospital system struggling with aging infrastructure, outdated technology systems, and the ongoing challenge of providing quality care while maintaining profitability. They needed approximately $15 million for equipment upgrades, $8 million for electronic health record system implementation, and $12 million for facility expansion to meet growing community demand. $35 million. Less than 70% of my current liquid assets. I could fund their entire capital campaign and still have enough money left over to secure my children's futures and maintain our current lifestyle indefinitely. The question was how to reveal this capability in a way that would force David to confront every assumption he'd made about our marriage dynamic. That afternoon, while David was in his weekly department head meeting, I called Dr. Vance's office and scheduled a meeting. Her assistant was friendly but clearly screening calls, asking detailed questions about the purpose of my visit and my background with healthcare investment. I gave careful answers that suggested serious interest without revealing the full scope of my resources. Dr. Vance has been hoping to hear from you, the assistant said, after checking the calendar. She mentioned that several community members had suggested you might be interested in discussing the hospital's strategic development plans. We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. during David's standing budget review session. I would finally have the opportunity to present myself as the financially sophisticated partner I'd always been, rather than the domestic support system David had convinced everyone I was. The week leading up to the meeting was a strange exercise in parallel preparation. David spent his evenings reviewing hospital efficiency reports and practicing presentations for what he assumed would be his upcoming promotion. He'd spread budget documents across our dining room table, muttering about cost containment strategies and personnel optimization, completely absorbed in his vision of himself as the hospital's financial savior. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own research into Pine Valley's operational challenges, analyzing their competitive position within the regional healthcare market, and developing preliminary investment strategies that could address both their immediate capital needs and their long-term sustainability goals. My analysis was more comprehensive than anything David was preparing, because I had access to information he didn't know existed. I'd reached out to former colleagues who now worked in healthcare investment, gathering insights about successful hospital modernization projects and the metrics that mattered most to institutional investors. I'd studied comparable medical centers that had undergone similar capital expansions, identifying best practices and potential pitfalls. Most importantly, I'd begun developing a proposal that would demonstrate not just my financial capacity but my strategic thinking about healthcare innovation. This wasn't going to be a simple offer to write a check. I wanted to present a comprehensive vision for Pine Valley's future that would be impossible for David to dismiss as amateur enthusiasm. The contrast between our preparations was striking. David was focused on incremental improvements within existing budget constraints, approaching the hospital's challenges from the perspective of cost reduction and efficiency optimization. I was thinking about transformational investment that could position Pine Valley as a regional leader in medical technology and patient care innovation. On Wednesday night, David was particularly energetic about his upcoming presentation to the board. I think I've identified at least $2 million in potential savings through supply chain optimization and staffing adjustments, he said, showing me spreadsheets covered in highlighted cells and handwritten notes. If I can demonstrate that kind of financial impact, the promotion to Chief Financial Officer is almost guaranteed. I made appropriate sounds of support and admiration while mentally noting that he was celebrating the possibility of saving $2 million while I was preparing to discuss investing $35 million. The scale differential perfectly illustrated how completely he'd misunderstood both our family's resources and my capabilities. The key is showing them that I understand the big picture, David continued, warming to his favorite theme about his own strategic vision. Anyone can cut individual line items, but it takes real financial expertise to see how all the pieces fit together, how short-term investments in efficiency can generate long-term savings. That sounds like exactly the kind of thinking they need, I agreed, wondering what he'd say if he knew that while he was optimizing supply chain costs, I'd been researching the feasibility of funding an entire new cardiac wing. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched my nervous energy. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, wanting to look professional and sophisticated without appearing to be playing dress-up. The navy blue suit I'd selected was expensive but understated, paired with jewelry that was elegant without being flashy. I wanted Dr. Vance to take me seriously as a potential partner, not dismiss me as a bored housewife looking for a charitable hobby. David left for work without asking about my plans for the day. As usual, his Thursday schedule was predictable. Budget meetings from 9 to 11, administrative review from 11 to 1, then the budget committee session that would run until at least 4 p.m. He'd be completely absorbed in hospital politics and financial analysis while I was across town, revealing that his assumptions about our family's economic situation were entirely wrong. Pine Valley Medical Center occupied a sprawling campus on the outskirts of Millbrook Heights, a collection of buildings that had been expanded and renovated over several decades. The original structure dated to the 1960s, with newer additions that reflected changing architectural styles and medical technologies. It was exactly the kind of institutional environment where David felt most comfortable, surrounded by organizational charts and budget reports and the comfortable hierarchy of hospital administration. Dr. Vance's office was in the newer administrative wing, with windows overlooking the employee parking lot and a view of the mountains beyond. Her assistant directed me to a small conference room where Dr. Vance was waiting, with a legal pad covered in handwritten notes and a laptop displaying what appeared to be financial projections. "Claire, thank you so much for coming in," she said, standing to shake my hand. Patricia Vance was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "I've been hoping we'd have a chance to talk since the holiday party." "I appreciate you making time in your schedule," I replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I understand you've been working on some significant strategic initiatives for the hospital." "That's putting it mildly," Dr. Vance said with a slight smile. "We're at a critical juncture where we either invest in modernization or risk becoming irrelevant in an increasingly competitive healthcare market. The challenge is finding the capital to fund the kind of comprehensive upgrade we need." She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me, displaying a presentation titled Pine Valley Medical Center Strategic Development Plan 2024 to 2029. The financial projections matched what I'd estimated from my own research, confirming that my analysis had been accurate. "We need approximately $35 million over the next 5 years to maintain our position as the primary healthcare provider for this region," Dr. Vance continued. "Traditional funding sources have been limited. Banks are reluctant to extend large credit lines to smaller hospitals. Government grants are increasingly competitive, and our current donor base, while generous, doesn't have the capacity for this scale of investment." I studied the presentation slides, noting the areas where my own research had identified additional opportunities they hadn't considered. "Have you explored private investment partnerships?" I asked, There are models where individual investors or family foundations provide capital in exchange for governance participation and long-term strategic input. Dr. Vance's eyebrows rose slightly. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. Most people approach healthcare philanthropy from a traditional charity model, writing checks for specific equipment or programs. But what we really need is strategic partnership with people who understand both healthcare challenges and investment principles. This was the opening I'd been hoping for. I'd be interested in discussing that kind of partnership, I said carefully. Depending on the structure and governance arrangements, I might be able to participate at a significant level. When you say significant level, what kind of range are we discussing? Dr. Vance asked directly. I want to make sure we're having a realistic conversation about what's possible. I took a breath, knowing that my next words would begin a process that couldn't be reversed. I could potentially fund the entire capital campaign, I said quietly. All $35 million, either as a direct investment or through a structured partnership that would give the hospital access to the funds while maintaining appropriate oversight and strategic input. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Vance stared at me for several seconds, clearly trying to process what I'd just said. I could see her mental calculations, trying to reconcile the woman sitting across from her with the financial capacity I'd just claimed. Claire, she said slowly, I need to ask you directly. Are you saying that you personally have access to $35 million in investment capital? I'm saying that I have liquid assets that would allow me to make that level of commitment, yes, I replied. Obviously, any investment of this magnitude would require extensive due diligence, legal review, and structured agreements that protect both parties' interests. But from a pure capital perspective, yes, this is within my current capacity. Dr. Vance leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to intense interest. This conversation just became much more serious than I expected, she said. Can you help me understand your background? Because what you're describing suggests a level of wealth that would make you one of the most significant potential donors in the region. I'd prepared for this question, knowing that my claims would require substantiation. I've been involved in technology investment for several years, primarily in cryptocurrency and emerging tech startups. Some of those investments have been extremely successful. I paused, then decided to reveal a bit more. My current portfolio value is approximately $52 million. The number hung in the air between us like a challenge to reality. Dr. Vance was clearly struggling to reconcile this information with what she knew about me from social interactions and David's dismissive comments about my domestic focus. $52 million, she repeated slowly. And this is money that you control independently? Yes, entirely independent assets that I've developed through my own investment activities. I met her gaze directly. My husband isn't aware of the full extent of these holdings. Understanding dawned in Dr. Vance's eyes, along with what I interpreted as respect for the complexity of my situation. That explains some things, she said thoughtfully, including why David seemed so surprised when I mentioned your potential interest in strategic philanthropy. David has certain assumptions about my capabilities and interests, I said carefully. He's not wrong that I've been focused on family responsibilities, but he's made some incorrect conclusions about what that means for my other activities and knowledge. Dr. Vance nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand the dynamics here. And I have to say, Claire, if what you're telling me is accurate, this could be transformational for Pine Valley. But I also recognize that we're talking about a situation that goes far beyond hospital funding. This is about your marriage, your family, your personal choices about financial disclosure. I'm aware of the broader implications, I assured her. I wouldn't have initiated this conversation if I weren't prepared to follow through. But I want to make sure that any partnership we develop is structured professionally, with appropriate legal framework and strategic oversight. This isn't charity, it's investment in community healthcare infrastructure. Understood completely. If we're going to proceed, we'll need comprehensive financial verification, legal review, and a governance structure that reflects your level of investment. Dr. Vance made notes on her legal pad. But first, I need to ask about timing. When you say your husband isn't aware of your assets, are you planning to discuss this with him before we move forward? This was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I'm planning to discuss it with him, yes, but I want to have our preliminary agreements in place first. I want to present this as a completed decision rather than a proposal he can veto or modify. Dr. Vance was quiet for a moment, clearly considering the ethical and practical implications of my request. Claire, I understand that you want to maintain control over your own financial decisions. But if we're going to develop a partnership of this magnitude, I need to be confident that all parties with potential legal interest in these assets are aware of the commitment being made. I understand your position, I said. Let me suggest a timeline. Give me 2 weeks to arrange my personal disclosures. During that time, we can develop the preliminary framework for our partnership. Once I've had the necessary conversations with David, we can move forward with formal agreements and public announcements. That seems reasonable, Dr. Vance agreed. And Claire, I want you to know that whatever happens with your personal situation, I'm impressed by what you're proposing. This kind of strategic thinking about healthcare investment is exactly what we need more of in this community. As I left Pine Valley Medical Center that afternoon, I felt the exhilaration that comes from finally revealing your true capabilities after years of hiding them. Dr. Vance had seen me as David never had, as a strategic partner capable of transformational thinking, rather than a domestic support system requiring protection from complex decisions. But I also felt the weight of what I'd set in motion. In 2 weeks, I would need to tell David that every assumption he'd made about our marriage, our finances, and my capabilities had been wrong. That while he'd been earning his administrative salary and planning modest efficiency improvements, I'd been building a fortune that could reshape our community's healthcare future. The conversation would end our marriage as we'd known it. David's identity was too tied up in being the financial expert, the strategic thinker, the provider and protector. Learning that I'd been secretly more successful than he'd ever dreamed of being would challenge everything he believed about himself and our relationship. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook Heights, I realized I was ready for that conversation. I'd spent 12 years being smaller than I was, less capable than I knew myself to be. The woman who just committed $35 million to transforming Pine Valley Medical Center was the person I'd always been underneath the carefully maintained facade of domestic contentment. In 2 weeks, David would meet her for the first time. I was curious to see how he'd respond when the housewife he'd dismissed proved to be the most significant investor in our community's future. The discovery that would shatter David's world came not from any grand revelation I orchestrated, but from his own suspicious nature turning against him. 5 days after my meeting with Dr. Vance, David's jealousy and need for control led him to cross a line that exposed the full magnitude of what I'd been hiding. It started with what should have been an innocent comment over breakfast. Sophie was struggling with a math problem that involved calculating compound interest, and I was helping her understand how money could grow exponentially over time when invested wisely. So if you put $100 in an account that earns 10% each year, I explained, after 10 years you'd have about $259. But after 20 years you'd have $673, even though you never added any more money. Sophie's eyes widened with understanding. So the money makes more money? Exactly. That's called compound interest, and it's one of the most powerful forces in finance. Albert Einstein supposedly called it the eighth wonder of the world. David looked up from his tablet where he'd been reading hospital industry news. That's a nice theoretical example, Claire, but real investment returns are much more complex than that. There are fees, taxes, market volatility, inflation to consider. It's not as simple as just earning 10% every year. Of course, I agreed mildly. I was just trying to help Sophie understand the basic concept. Right, the basic concept is fine for homework problems. But I don't want her getting unrealistic expectations about how investing actually works. Most people lose money when they try to play the market without proper expertise. Sophie looked between us, sensing tension she didn't understand. Can I finish this later? She asked, closing her math book. Of course, sweetheart, I said, kissing the top of her head as she headed upstairs to get ready for school. David waited until he heard her bedroom door close before continuing. I've been thinking about that conversation you mentioned with Patricia Vance, the one about the donor committee. What about it? I'm concerned that you might be giving people the wrong impression about our financial situation. We're comfortable, certainly, but we're not in a position to make significant charitable contributions. My salary is good, but not extraordinary, and with college funds to build and retirement to plan for, we need to be conservative with our resources. This was David's fundamental misunderstanding laid bare. He genuinely believed that our family's financial future depended entirely on his hospital administrator's salary and whatever modest savings he'd accumulated through his conservative investment approach. He had no conception that the woman sitting across from him had already secured their children's college educations and their retirement multiple times over. I understand your concerns, I said carefully. I would never commit us to anything we couldn't afford. I know you wouldn't intentionally, but sometimes when you're talking to other people, especially about topics like technology or finance, you might sound more knowledgeable than you actually are. People could get the wrong idea about your expertise or our resources. The condescension was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. David was essentially telling me that I was too stupid to recognize my own ignorance, that my attempts to engage in intelligent conversation were embarrassing displays of incompetence that might mislead others about our family's capabilities. What kind of wrong idea? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Well, for instance, Patricia mentioned that you seemed very informed about healthcare technology investment, but Claire, you haven't worked in technology for over a decade, and healthcare finance is an incredibly specialized field. I wouldn't want her to think you have expertise you don't actually possess. And what if I do possess that expertise? David's laugh was dismissive and final. Come on, Claire. Where would you have gained expertise in healthcare finance? From reading articles online? From listening to podcasts while you're doing laundry? There's a difference between being generally informed and having the kind of knowledge that would be valuable for strategic decision-making. That afternoon, while David was at work and the children were at their after-school programs, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my private banker, Marcus Webb, who managed the majority of my investments through a discreet wealth management firm in downtown Seattle. Claire, good to hear from you, Marcus said when his assistant connected the call. How are things in Millbrook Heights? Complicated, I admitted. Marcus, I need to ask you about something sensitive. If my husband were to somehow gain access to our family's financial accounts, what would he be able to see? There was a pause while Marcus considered the implications of my question. He'd been managing my portfolio for 4 years and was well aware that David had no knowledge of my investment activities. Well, the accounts we manage for you are entirely in your name, using your maiden name and the post office box address. If he were to check your joint checking and savings accounts, he'd see the standard household financial activity. But unless he specifically knew to look for Morrison Holdings LLC or had access to your personal accounts, there's no trail that would lead him to your investment portfolio. What about tax filings? We file jointly. That's where things get more complex, Marcus admitted. Your investment income is reported on your joint returns, but it's itemized in ways that might not be immediately obvious to someone who isn't looking for it. The cryptocurrency gains are listed under capital gains. The dividend income is aggregated with other investment returns. Unless he's studying the returns line by line with an understanding of what to look for, he might not realize the magnitude of your independent holdings. But if he did look carefully, then yes, he'd see income that doesn't match what he knows about your activities. Claire, can I ask, what's prompting these questions? Are you concerned about disclosure? I explained the situation with Dr. Vance and the hospital investment, as well as David's increasingly dismissive attitudes about my capabilities. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. It sounds like you're approaching a decision point, he said when I finished. You've built substantial wealth while maintaining your privacy, but now you want to deploy that wealth in ways that will necessarily make it visible. That's going to require some difficult conversations. I know. But Marcus, I need to understand exactly what I'm revealing. Can you prepare a complete portfolio summary? Everything. The cryptocurrency holdings, the startup investments, the real estate partnerships, the traditional securities. I want a document that shows the full scope of what I've built. Of course, I can have that ready by tomorrow. Claire, this portfolio represents some of the most successful individual investment decisions I've seen in my career. You should be extremely proud of what you've accomplished. Thank you. That means more than you know. The next morning, I drove to Marcus's office to pick up the portfolio summary. The document was comprehensive and devastating. $52,400,000 in total assets. Cryptocurrency holdings worth $28 million. Startup equity positions valued at $12 million. Real estate investment partnerships worth $8 million. Traditional securities and cash equivalents worth $4.4 million. More shocking than the total was the performance history. My average annual return over the past 7 years was 34%, far exceeding any benchmark index or professional fund manager. The document included detailed charts showing how each investment decision had contributed to the overall growth, creating a clear picture of sophisticated financial acumen rather than lucky gambling. I sat in my car outside Marcus's office, studying the numbers that represented my secret life. This wasn't just money, it was proof of intelligence, strategic thinking, risk assessment, and market analysis that David insisted I was incapable of. Every successful investment was evidence that his fundamental assumptions about my capabilities were not just wrong but absurdly wrong. That evening, David came home in an unusually good mood. "Great news," he announced as he hung up his coat. "The board approved my efficiency proposal. We're looking at potential savings of $2.3 million over the next fiscal year." "That's wonderful," I said, thinking about how his career-defining achievement represented less than 5% of my cryptocurrency gains from the previous month. Patricia Vance was particularly complimentary. She said my analysis demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking the hospital needs at the senior leadership level. David poured himself a celebratory glass of wine. "I think the CFO position is almost certain now. You've worked very hard for this opportunity." Speaking of Patricia, she mentioned something interesting. Apparently there's been some gossip in the community about a potential major donor for the hospital's capital campaign. Someone with significant technology investment background who might be interested in strategic partnership rather than traditional philanthropy. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. That sounds promising for the hospital. It would be if it's real. But Patricia seemed to think this person might have connections to our social circle. She asked if I knew anyone locally who had that kind of wealth and investment expertise. David's tone carried a note of puzzlement. I told her I couldn't think of anyone who fit that description. Most of the tech money in the region is concentrated in Seattle, not suburban communities like ours. What kind of money are we talking about? She was vague about specifics, but mentioned that this potential donor had indicated they could fund the entire $35 million capital campaign independently. David shook his head with amused skepticism. Which sounds like fantasy to me. People with that kind of wealth don't live quietly in places like Millbrook Heights. They have mansions in Bellevue or waterfront estates on Mercer Island. The irony was perfect. David was dismissing as impossible the exact scenario I'd already set in motion, using assumptions about wealth and geography that demonstrated how little he understood about modern investment success. Some of the most successful cryptocurrency investors were people who'd maintained deliberately modest lifestyles while building extraordinary portfolios through digital assets. Maybe it's someone who prefers privacy, I suggested. Claire, $35 million isn't the kind of money you can hide. That level of wealth requires infrastructure, professional management, legal structures. You can't just accumulate that kind of asset base without it being visible in your lifestyle, your social connections, your professional relationships. As David spoke with such authority about wealth accumulation and management, I was holding a folder containing documents that proved him comprehensively wrong. Not only was it possible to build and manage substantial wealth while maintaining a modest public profile, I'd been doing exactly that for years, while he remained completely oblivious. Has Drive Vance given you any more details about this potential donor? I asked. Nothing concrete. She's being appropriately discreet, which suggests the person might be legitimate. But I suspect when we get more information, we'll find out it's either someone with unrealistic expectations about their actual financial capacity, or an out-of-state investor who's not seriously committed to our community. That night, after David fell asleep, I sat in my home office reviewing the portfolio summary and considering my next moves. In 1 week, I would need to tell David that the mysterious donor he'd dismissed as fantasy was his own wife. That the financial expertise he insisted I lacked had generated more wealth than he'd earned in multiple lifetimes. That every condescending comment about my limited understanding of investment principles had been not just wrong but ridiculous. But I was also beginning to understand that David's reaction would be more complex than simple embarrassment about being wrong. His entire identity was built around being the financial expert in our relationship, the strategic thinker, the person who understood complex systems, while I handled domestic simplicities. Learning that I'd been vastly more successful than him at the very skills he considered his professional expertise would threaten the fundamental structure of his self-concept. The next few days passed in a strange atmosphere of parallel preparations. David was working on his presentation for the board position, confident that his demonstrated ability to save the hospital $2 million proved his executive capabilities. Meanwhile, I was finalizing legal documents that would allow me to invest 15 times that amount in the hospital's future. The cognitive dissonance was becoming difficult to maintain. During dinner conversations, David would lecture me about financial responsibility and the importance of conservative investment strategies, while I mentally compared his advice to my actual portfolio performance. When he explained healthcare economics to me as if I were a child learning basic concepts, I thought about my detailed analysis of Pine Valley's competitive position and capital needs. Most difficult were the moments when David's condescension was delivered as loving protection. He genuinely believed he was shielding me from embarrassment and disappointment by managing my expectations about my own capabilities. In his mind, preventing me from attempting things I'd supposedly fail at was an act of kindness. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when David's laptop crashed while he was working on his board presentation. In his panic, he asked to borrow my computer to finish his work before the next morning's deadline. "Just be careful," I said, handing him my obvious laptop, the one I used for household management and the children's school activities. "Everything important is saved, but I'd rather not lose my grocery lists and volunteer schedules." What I didn't mention was that my real computer, the one containing access to my investment accounts and financial documents, was safely locked in my office drawer. David would be using the decoy device that contained exactly the kind of domestic digital life he expected me to have. 2 hours later, David called me into the kitchen where he was working at the table. His expression was confused and slightly suspicious. "Claire, I found something strange on your computer. There's a browser bookmark for something called Morrison Holdings Portfolio Dashboard. When I clicked on it, it asked for login credentials I don't recognize." My heart stopped, but I kept my voice steady. "I have no idea what that is. Maybe it's an old bookmark from when I was helping with school fundraising. Sometimes I research local businesses for sponsorship opportunities." David studied my face carefully. "Morrison Holdings. That's your maiden name." "Yes, so? So why would there be a bookmark for a financial portfolio using your maiden name on your personal computer?" I could see David's analytical mind working through the implications, trying to construct explanations that fit within his understanding of our relationship. The existence of financial accounts in my maiden name suggested either identity theft, secret debt, or secret assets. Given his assumptions about my financial acumen, identity theft probably seemed most likely. "David, I honestly don't know what that bookmark is or how it got there. Maybe it's some kind of spam or phishing attempt? You know how sometimes strange things appear in browser bookmarks?" But David was no longer listening to my explanations. He'd opened his phone and was calling the customer service number for our bank. "I'd like to verify account information for Claire Morrison Henderson," he said when the call connected. After providing identifying information and answering security questions, he asked, "Can you tell me what accounts are currently open under that name?" I watched his face change as the customer service representative provided information I couldn't hear. His confusion transformed into something harder, more focused. "I see. And when were those accounts opened?" Another pause. "What kind of balances are we talking about?" The conversation continued for several more minutes, with David asking increasingly specific questions about account activity, transaction history, and associated businesses. When he finally hung up, his expression was unreadable. "Claire," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About the fact that you apparently have financial accounts I don't know about. Accounts that have been active for years, with what the bank described as, quote, substantial balances, and, quote, complex investment activity." There was no point in continuing the deception. David had crossed the line into active investigation, and my secret was unraveling faster than I could manage. But I also realized that this confrontation was happening on his terms, driven by his suspicion and control needs rather than my strategic planning. "Yes," I said simply. "I have investment accounts that you don't know about." "Investment accounts worth how much, Claire?" I met his gaze directly. "Approximately $52 million. The silence that followed was profound and devastating. David stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, his mind clearly struggling to process information that didn't fit within any framework he possessed for understanding our relationship. $52 million, he repeated slowly. "You're telling me that you, my wife, who handles household budgets and volunteers at school functions, somehow have $52 million in secret investment accounts?" "Yes." "Where did this money come from, Claire?" "I earned it through cryptocurrency investments and technology startup funding over the past 7 years." David's laugh was bitter and disbelieving. "Cryptocurrency? The housewife who asks me to explain basic financial concepts to her has somehow become a cryptocurrency millionaire." "I never asked you to explain financial concepts to me, David. You insisted on explaining them whether I wanted your input or not." "Don't try to turn this around on me," David snapped. "We're talking about the fact that you've been lying to me about millions of dollars for years. We're talking about financial fraud, tax evasion, marriage fraud. There's no fraud involved. The money is legally earned and properly reported on our joint tax returns. You just never paid attention to the investment income sections." David grabbed our tax folder from the kitchen counter and began flipping through the previous year's return. I watched as he found the pages he'd previously ignored, the sections detailing capital gains and dividend income that he'd assumed represented minor household investments. "These numbers," he said, pointing to figures that suddenly took on new meaning. "This investment income. You're telling me this represents millions of dollars in capital gains?" "Yes. And the business income from Morrison Holdings, LLC? That's my investment management company. I established it to handle the startup equity positions and real estate partnerships." David sank into a chair, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what I was revealing. "Claire, this changes everything. Our entire marriage, our financial planning, our future, everything we've discussed about the children's education and our retirement. You've been living a completely different life than the one we've been sharing." "No, David. I've been living the same life, just with knowledge and resources that you never bothered to recognize or acknowledge. Knowledge and resources that you hid from me. Knowledge and resources that you told me I was incapable of possessing." We stared at each other across the kitchen table, 12 years of marriage, suddenly reframed by the revelation that one of us had been fundamentally wrong about the other's capabilities and contributions. David had spent over a decade positioning himself as the financial expert while dismissing my intelligence and potential. Now he was learning that during those same years, I'd been building wealth that made his professional achievements insignificant by comparison. "I need to see the actual accounts," David said finally. "I need to understand the full scope of what you've been hiding." I retrieved my portfolio documents from the office and spread them across the table. David studied each page with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that challenged everything he believed about reality. The cryptocurrency holdings, the startup investments, the real estate partnerships, the performance charts showing consistent returns that far exceeded professional benchmarks. "This is impossible," he said repeatedly. "Claire, this level of investment success doesn't happen by accident. These returns suggest sophisticated market analysis, risk management, timing strategies. Where did you learn these skills?" "The same place I learned everything else you've assumed I'm incapable of understanding, through research, analysis, and practical application." "But why didn't you tell me? Why would you hide this from your own husband?" I looked at David, This man who'd spent years dismissing my intelligence, while I quietly proved him wrong in the most concrete way possible. How could I explain that I'd hidden my success because he'd made it clear he couldn't tolerate the idea of me being competent in areas he considered his domain? Because every time I tried to demonstrate knowledge or interest in financial matters, you shut me down. You told me I didn't understand, that I should leave those decisions to you, that my attempts to contribute were embarrassing and inappropriate. That's not the same as hiding $50 million, isn't it? David, 3 weeks ago you publicly dismissed me as, quote, just a housewife, with no relevant knowledge or expertise. Last week you lectured me about the difference between reading articles and having real understanding. You've spent our entire marriage telling me that I'm not smart enough to handle complex financial decisions. What exactly did you expect me to do with information that proved you wrong? David was quiet for a long time, studying the documents that represented a version of his wife he'd never imagined could exist. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something I'd never heard from him before: uncertainty. Claire, if this is real, if you actually have this much money and this level of investment expertise, then everything I thought I knew about our marriage is wrong. Yes, I agreed quietly. Everything you thought you knew is wrong. David's first instinct was to attack the legitimacy of what I'd built, as if proving my investments were somehow fraudulent would restore his understanding of our relationship and his place within it. Over the next 3 days, he transformed from a shocked husband into an investigative auditor, demanding documentation for every transaction, questioning the ethics of my investment strategies, and searching for evidence that my success was either illegal or unsustainable. These cryptocurrency gains, he said on Saturday morning, spreading my trading records across our dining room table like evidence in a criminal case. The IRS considers crypto trading to be extremely high-risk speculation. How do I know you haven't committed tax violations or engaged in money laundering? I poured coffee and sat across from him, watching my normally composed husband frantically try to find flaws in investment strategies that had generated more wealth than he'd seen in several lifetimes. David, every transaction is documented and properly reported. Marcus Webb's firm handles all the compliance requirements, and we've never had any issues with tax authorities. Marcus Webb, David repeated, seizing on the name. Who is Marcus Webb, and how long have you been working with him without my knowledge? He's a private wealth manager in Seattle. I've been working with his firm for 4 years. 4 years of secret meetings with financial advisors I've never heard of, making investment decisions that could affect our family's entire future. David's voice carried that tone of moral outrage he usually reserved for discussing hospital administrators who'd made what he considered irresponsible budget decisions. Claire, this isn't just about hiding money. This is about fundamental dishonesty in our marriage. The accusation was rich, coming from someone who'd spent 12 years systematically dismissing my intelligence and capabilities. But I could see that David genuinely felt betrayed, as if my success had somehow been stolen from him rather than achieved independently despite his discouragement. Would you like to meet with Marcus? I asked. I'm sure he'd be happy to walk you through the investment philosophy and risk management strategies we've used. Of course I want to meet with him. I want to understand how my wife secretly became one of the wealthiest people in our community, while I thought we were living on a hospital administrator's salary. The meeting with Marcus was scheduled for the following Tuesday at his downtown Seattle office. David spent the intervening days preparing for the appointment, like he was deposing a hostile witness, developing lists of questions about investment methodologies, regulatory compliance, tax implications, and portfolio sustainability. I still don't understand the timing, he said Monday evening while reviewing his notes. Why did you suddenly start making these investments 7 years ago? What changed? I thought about how to answer honestly without further damaging his already fragile ego. The truth was that I'd started investing seriously around the time David's condescension had become unbearable, when I'd realized that his view of me as intellectually limited was becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. The investments had been my way of proving to myself that I was still the capable person I'd once been. I missed the intellectual challenge of understanding complex systems, I said carefully. The children were getting older and more independent, and I had mental capacity that wasn't being fully utilized. So you decided to risk our family's financial security on speculative investments instead of discussing it with me first? David, I started with $20,000 from my old 401k. Money that was entirely mine and that you'd forgotten existed. I only invested what I could afford to lose completely. But then it grew into millions of dollars, and you still didn't tell me. When exactly should I have told you? When you were explaining to me why I couldn't possibly understand healthcare economics. When you were dismissing my opinions about technology trends. When you were publicly describing me as just a housewife whose opinions weren't worth considering. David was quiet for a moment, perhaps beginning to recognize how his own behavior had contributed to my secrecy. But rather than acknowledging the pattern of dismissal, he redirected toward what he saw as my deception. Regardless of how I may have communicated about your interests, hiding millions of dollars is a completely different level of dishonesty. This affects our children's futures, our retirement planning, our entire life strategy. Actually, it secures our children's futures and our retirement in ways you never imagined possible. Jake and Sophie each have education trusts worth over $2 million. Our retirement is funded at a level that would allow us to maintain our current lifestyle indefinitely without either of us ever working again. The numbers seemed to physically impact David, causing him to sink back in his chair as he processed the implications. His careful planning for modest college savings and conservative retirement accounts had been rendered irrelevant by wealth he hadn't known existed. The meeting with Marcus took place in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, with Seattle's skyline providing a backdrop that emphasized the scope of what we were discussing. Marcus had prepared a comprehensive presentation that walked through every aspect of my investment strategy, from the initial cryptocurrency purchases through the complex startup equity positions that had generated the largest returns. David asked detailed questions about each investment category, clearly trying to find evidence of excessive risk-taking or unsound financial judgment. But Marcus's responses demonstrated that my approach had been consistently sophisticated, well-researched, and appropriately diversified for someone with my risk tolerance and investment timeline. Mrs. Henderson's cryptocurrency investments were made during a period when institutional adoption was accelerating, but retail awareness was still limited, Marcus explained, displaying charts that showed my entry points relative to major market movements. Her timing wasn't lucky. It was based on fundamental analysis of blockchain technology adoption patterns and regulatory development trends. But cryptocurrency is inherently speculative, David protested. Financial advisors generally recommend limiting crypto exposure to 5% of a portfolio at most. That's true for conventional portfolios managed according to traditional risk models, Marcus agreed. But Mrs. Henderson had several advantages that justified a higher allocation. Her technology background allowed her to evaluate projects based on technical merit rather than just market sentiment. Her long investment timeline meant she could tolerate short-term volatility, and her other income sources provided stability that reduced the overall portfolio risk. David shifted to questioning the startup investments, clearly hoping to find evidence of imprudent speculation. These early-stage companies, he said, pointing to a list of my equity positions, most startups fail completely. How is this different from gambling? Marcus smiled slightly. Mr. Henderson, let me show you something interesting. He pulled up a comparison chart showing my startup investment performance against professional venture capital funds over the same time period. Mrs. Henderson's success rate has been 67%, with average returns of 430% on successful investments. The top-tier VC funds typically see success rates around 25%, with average returns of 200%. That's impossible, David said flatly. Professional investors with decades of experience and research teams don't achieve those kinds of results consistently. You're absolutely right that those results are exceptional, Marcus agreed. But they're not impossible when you combine technological expertise with disciplined investment principles. Mrs. Henderson identified 3 companies that were eventually acquired by major tech giants, investments that generated the majority of her startup returns. In each case, her technical background allowed her to recognize the value of their innovations before they became obvious to the broader investment community. I watched David processing this information, seeing him struggle with the cognitive dissonance between his assumptions about my capabilities and the evidence of my actual performance. Marcus was essentially explaining that I'd outperformed professional investors because my expertise exceeded theirs in specific areas. a concept that contradicted everything David believed about our respective knowledge levels. What about risk management? David asked, grasping for some area where my approach might be criticized. Surely concentrating so much wealth in volatile assets is imprudent. Marcus turned to another section of his presentation. Actually, Mrs. Henderson has been quite conservative about risk management as her portfolio grew. She's systematically reduced her exposure to high volatility assets and increased her allocation to stable income-producing investments. Currently, about 40% of her holdings are in traditional securities and real estate, providing steady cash flow and principal protection. Traditional securities, David repeated. You mean stocks and bonds. High-grade corporate bonds, dividend-paying blue-chip stocks, REITs, and some government securities. The kind of boring, stable investments that financial planners recommend for wealth preservation rather than wealth generation. David looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. So you're telling me that Claire has not only built this portfolio through high-risk investments, but she's also been smart enough to shift toward conservative strategies as the amounts became larger. Exactly. That's the mark of sophisticated investment thinking. Many people who achieve early success through aggressive strategies fail to adjust their approach as their circumstances change. Mrs. Henderson recognized that her priorities should shift from wealth accumulation to wealth preservation as her assets grew. The meeting continued for another hour, with Marcus patiently answering David's increasingly desperate questions. By the end, it was clear that every aspect of my investment approach had been thoughtful, well-researched, and appropriately managed. There was no fraud, no excessive risk-taking, no lucky gambling that could be dismissed as unsustainable. As we left Marcus's office, David was unusually quiet. The drive back to Millbrook Heights passed without the kind of analytical discussion that typically followed his professional meetings. Instead, he stared out the window at the city skyline, apparently lost in thoughts he wasn't ready to share. That evening, I received a call from Dr. Vance. Claire, I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I wanted to discuss the timeline for our hospital partnership. The board has reviewed our preliminary proposal, and they're extremely enthusiastic about moving forward. I glanced at David, who was pretending to read but clearly listening to my conversation. That's wonderful news, Patricia. What kind of timeline are they considering? They'd like to announce the partnership within the next 2 weeks, assuming we can finalize the legal framework. The publicity would help us with other fundraising efforts and community support. Would that work with your schedule? 2 weeks. That would mean revealing my investment in Pine Valley Medical Center before David had fully processed the reality of my hidden wealth. The timing was less than ideal, but the hospital's needs were real and urgent. Yes, I think we can make that timeline work, I said. Let me review the documentation you sent and get back to you with any questions. After I hung up, David looked at me with undisguised curiosity. That was Patricia Vance? Yes. Calling you directly about hospital business. Yes. Claire, what exactly is your relationship with Patricia and the hospital administration? This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating. David had discovered my financial resources, but he still didn't know about my planned investment in his workplace. The conversation with Marcus had established that my wealth was real and legitimately earned, but it hadn't addressed how I intended to use that wealth in ways that would directly impact David's professional environment. I've been discussing a potential investment partnership with the hospital, I said simply. What kind of investment partnership? They need $35 million for capital improvements. I've offered to provide that funding in exchange for strategic input and governance participation. David stared at me in complete silence for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're telling me that you're the mysterious donor Patricia has been talking about. The one I said couldn't possibly exist. Yes, you're planning to give Pine Valley Medical Center $35 million. Not give, invest. This is a structured partnership that will provide them with capital while giving me influence over strategic decisions that affect our community's healthcare future. David stood up abruptly and began pacing around our living room. Claire, this is insane. You can't just decide to become the primary financial backer of my employer without discussing it with me first. Why not? You make decisions about your career and professional activities without consulting me about how they might affect our family dynamics. That's completely different. My job affects our income and schedule, But it doesn't involve becoming a major stakeholder in community institutions. Actually, it does. Your decisions as a hospital administrator affect healthcare access and quality for thousands of people in our community. The difference is that your influence is limited by budget constraints, while mine isn't. David stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. Do you understand what this will do to my position at the hospital? How can I maintain professional credibility when my wife is providing more funding than the entire annual operating budget? The same way you maintained professional credibility when you thought your wife was just a housewife with no relevant expertise. By focusing on your own performance rather than your spouse's activities. It's not the same thing at all. Having a wife who manages domestic responsibilities is normal and expected. Having a wife who's secretly one of the most significant healthcare investors in the region is unprecedented. I could see David's mind working through the implications, trying to understand how our social and professional relationships would change once my financial capabilities became public knowledge. He was realizing that the woman he'd dismissed as intellectually limited would soon be recognized as one of the most influential people in our community. What will people think? He asked, and for the first time in our marriage, I heard genuine uncertainty in his voice. People will think that you're married to someone with different capabilities than they previously understood. They'll think I'm either a fraud or an idiot. Either I've been lying about our financial situation, or I've been completely oblivious to my own wife's business activities. Or they'll think that you married someone who turned out to be more capable than anyone initially realized, including yourself. David sat back down, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of how his life was about to change. For 12 years, he'd been the successful partner in our marriage, the one with professional achievements and financial expertise. Now he was learning that his wife had been quietly building a fortune that made his accomplishments insignificant by comparison. Claire, I need to understand something. When you make this investment in the hospital, will you be taking an active role in management decisions? The partnership agreement includes governance participation proportional to my investment level. So yes, I'll be involved in strategic planning, budget allocation, and policy development. You'll be my wife and my boss. The starkness of his realization hung between us. David had spent our marriage positioning himself as the expert in professional and financial matters, while relegating me to domestic support. Now he was facing the possibility that I would have authority over his workplace, influence over his career advancement, and recognition as a strategic thinker in areas where he'd claimed expertise. I'll be your wife and a major stakeholder in the institution where you work, I corrected. Whether that makes me your boss depends on how the hospital structures reporting relationships. David was quiet for a long time, apparently processing the personal and professional implications of my revelation. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed from outrage to something more complex. I keep trying to understand when this version of you emerged, he said slowly. The Claire who makes multi-million-dollar investment decisions and negotiates strategic partnerships with major institutions. Where was she during the years when I thought I was married to someone who needed my guidance on financial matters? She was always here, David. You just never looked for her because you were convinced she couldn't exist. But why didn't you correct my assumptions? Why did you let me believe things about you that weren't true? I considered how to answer this question honestly without completely destroying what remained of our relationship. Because every time I tried to demonstrate knowledge or capabilities that didn't fit your expectations, you shut me down. You explained why I was wrong, why my perspective wasn't valuable, why I should leave those decisions to you. I was trying to be helpful. You were trying to maintain control. And eventually, I stopped trying to change your mind and started proving you wrong privately instead. David nodded slowly, perhaps beginning to understand how his own behavior had contributed to the situation we now faced. But I could also see him struggling with the ego damage of learning that his assumptions about his wife's limitations had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The next morning brought unexpected complications. David received a call from Dr. Martinez, the hospital's chief medical officer, asking if he could meet that afternoon to discuss some exciting developments with our capital campaign. They want to talk to me about the major donor situation, David told me after hanging up. Patricia must have mentioned that the investor has local connections. What will you tell them? I don't know yet. Claire, once this becomes public, everything changes for both of us. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and attention? I thought about the question seriously. For 7 years, I'd operated in complete privacy, making investment decisions without public scrutiny or social complications. Becoming a major healthcare philanthropist would necessarily make me a public figure in ways I'd never experienced. I'm prepared for the attention if it means being able to use these resources effectively, I said. I'm less prepared for the social dynamics with people who've known me as your supportive wife, rather than as an independent professional. People like Patricia, who've been treating you as my intellectual equal based on assumptions I tried to correct. People like Patricia, who recognized capabilities you've been denying existed. That afternoon, while David was meeting with the hospital leadership, I received another call from Marcus Webb. Claire, we have a complication that you need to be aware of. Word is starting to spread in the investment community about your hospital partnership. I've had 3 calls today from other healthcare systems, asking if you'd be interested in similar arrangements. Already? Healthcare investment is a small world, especially for projects of this magnitude. The fact that an individual investor is providing this level of capital for a regional medical center is unusual enough to generate significant interest. What kind of interest? Seattle Children's Hospital is interested in discussing a partnership for their new research wing. Virginia Mason wants to explore funding for their technology upgrade program. And I received a very interesting call from the University of Washington Medical Center about endowing a new institute for healthcare innovation. I tried to process the implications of what Marcus was telling me. I'd thought of the Pine Valley investment as a single strategic decision, but apparently it was positioning me as a major player in regional healthcare finance. Marcus, what does this mean practically? It means you're about to become one of the most visible healthcare philanthropists in the Pacific Northwest. People will want to understand your investment philosophy, your strategic priorities, your vision for healthcare innovation. You'll be invited to serve on boards, speak at conferences, participate in policy discussions at the state and federal level. And if I'm not interested in that level of public engagement, then you'll need to be very clear about your boundaries and very selective about future commitments. But Claire, with great wealth comes great opportunity to influence systems that affect millions of people. You've built these resources through exceptional skill and judgment. The question now is how you want to deploy them to create positive change. After Marcus hung up, I sat in my office trying to understand how my marriage revelation had evolved into a question about my role in regional healthcare policy. I'd started with the simple goal of proving to David that his assumptions about my capabilities were wrong. Now I was facing the possibility of becoming a public figure whose investment decisions could influence healthcare access for our entire region. That evening, David returned from his hospital meeting with a complex expression that combined excitement, confusion, and something approaching fear. Well, he said, hanging up his coat, that was one of the more surreal conversations of my professional career. What happened? Patricia and Dr. Martinez spent an hour explaining that they've identified a major investor for the capital campaign, someone with local connections who has the financial capacity and strategic vision to transform Pine Valley's future. David poured himself a large glass of wine before continuing. They asked if I had any insights about who this person might be, given my knowledge of the community's wealthy families. What did you tell them? I told them the truth. That I couldn't think of anyone in Millbrook Heights with that kind of wealth and healthcare investment expertise. David's smile was rueful. Then Patricia mentioned that they'd be announcing the partnership next week, and that the investor would be taking an active role in hospital governance. How did you respond to that? I said it sounded like an exciting development for the hospital's future, and that I looked forward to learning more about this mysterious benefactor. David met my eyes directly. Claire, they have no idea that the person they're describing is the wife of their own budget analyst. When they find out, it's going to be the most awkward professional situation I've ever experienced. It doesn't have to be awkward if you approach it professionally. How can it not be awkward? For months, I've been the guy explaining why certain capital investments aren't financially feasible. Next week, I'll be the guy whose wife is funding those same investments without blinking. I could see David beginning to understand that my public emergence as a major healthcare investor would fundamentally alter his professional identity and relationships. He was realizing that his colleagues would reassess every interaction they'd had with him through the lens of knowing his wife possessed resources and expertise that he'd consistently downplayed. David, this is an opportunity for both of us to have more influence over healthcare policy and community development. Instead of seeing it as a threat to your professional standing, maybe you could see it as a chance to achieve things that were never possible before. Or, it could be the end of my career credibility if people think I've been deceptive about our family's resources or my own financial acumen. Then make sure they understand that you're learning about my investment activities at the same time they are. Be honest about the fact that this is new information for you too. David considered this approach while finishing his wine. That might actually work, he said slowly. If I position myself as being as surprised as everyone else by your financial capabilities, it becomes a story about marital revelation rather than professional deception. Exactly. And David, once people understand what I've accomplished independently, they might also gain new respect for your judgment in choosing a partner. For the first time since learning about my hidden wealth, David smiled genuinely. You mean, instead of thinking I married someone who was intellectually limited, they'll think I was smart enough to marry someone whose capabilities exceeded what anyone initially recognized. Something like that. As we prepared for bed that night, David seemed to be approaching some kind of acceptance about our transformed circumstances, but I knew that the most challenging part still lay ahead. In 1 week, our community would learn that the dismissed housewife had become one of their most significant institutional investors. The social and professional dynamics that had defined our marriage for 12 years were about to be permanently altered by the public recognition of capabilities that had always existed but never been acknowledged. The question now was whether David could adapt to being married to someone whose achievements overshadowed his own, or whether his ego would require him to find new ways to diminish my success in order to maintain his sense of superiority. I suspected we'd have our answer very soon. The Pine Valley Medical Center board meeting, where my identity would be revealed, was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 p.m., open to community members and local media. Dr. Vance had suggested that I attend as a special guest to discuss the strategic partnership, though she'd been deliberately vague about the specifics when announcing the meeting to ensure maximum attendance and impact. David spent the week in a state of barely controlled anxiety, alternating between excitement about the hospital's future and dread about how his colleagues would react to learning his wife was their major benefactor. His behavior at work became increasingly erratic as he tried to navigate conversations about the mysterious investor, while knowing that person was sleeping next to him every night. Patricia asked me again today if I had any insights about the donor's background, he told me Tuesday evening. She mentioned that they'll be introducing this person as someone with deep connections to our community who's chosen to step forward at a critical moment for regional healthcare. That's an accurate description, I said, reviewing the legal documents that would formally establish our partnership. Claire, when they introduce you tomorrow night, what are you planning to say? How do you want to handle the fact that your own husband didn't know about your financial resources? I'd been thinking about this question for days. The public revelation needed to accomplish several things simultaneously. Establish my credibility as a serious investor, explain my strategic vision for healthcare innovation, and address the obvious questions about why my capabilities had been hidden for so long. I'm planning to be honest, I said. I'll explain that I've been actively investing for several years while maintaining a deliberately private profile. I'll focus on my vision for healthcare technology integration and community medical access rather than dwelling on personal dynamics. And when people ask why I never mentioned being married to a major investor, you can tell them the truth. That my investment activities were private, and that you're learning about their full scope at the same time as everyone else. David nodded, but I could see he was still struggling with how to position himself in relation to my emergence as a public figure. His entire professional identity had been built around being recognized as the financial expert in our relationship, and he was about to watch that dynamic permanently reversed. Wednesday brought an unexpected complication when Sophie came home from school with questions that made me realize how quickly word was spreading through our community networks. Mom, Emma Rodriguez said her mom heard that someone really rich is going to save the hospital, Sophie said while unpacking her backpack. She said it might be someone we know, but nobody knows who it is. I exchanged glances with David, who was clearly wondering how much to tell our children before the public announcement. We'd discussed this conversation, but hadn't reached a definitive decision about timing. There is someone who's planning to help the hospital with some important improvements, I said carefully. We'll know more about the details soon. Is it anyone we know? Jake asked, looking up from his homework. David cleared his throat. Actually, kids, we need to talk to you about something important. Tomorrow night there's going to be a big announcement about the hospital, and it's going to affect our family in some significant ways. Both children looked immediately concerned, probably wondering if David was losing his job or if we were moving. I realized we needed to frame this conversation carefully to help them understand what was happening without creating anxiety about major life changes. Your mom has been doing some work that we haven't talked much about, David continued. She's been making investments and building a business that's become very successful. Tomorrow night, she's going to announce that she's helping to fund major improvements at the hospital where I work. Sophie's eyes widened. Mom has a business? What kind of business? I invest in technology companies and other assets that I think will be valuable over time, I explained. Kind of like buying stocks, but with newer companies that most people haven't heard of yet. And it's been successful enough that you can help the hospital? Jake asked. Yes, quite successful. How successful? Sophie wanted to know, with the direct curiosity that children bring to adult financial matters. David and I looked at each other, realizing we needed to prepare our kids for the fact that their family's economic situation was about to become a matter of public interest and speculation. Successful enough that people are going to be very interested in our family, I said. There might be newspaper articles or TV news stories about the hospital announcement. People might ask you questions about our family or treat you differently because they know we have resources to help community projects. Are we rich? Jake asked bluntly. We're financially secure in ways that will allow us to help other people and organizations that are important to our community, David answered diplomatically. But are we rich? Rich? Like mansion and private jet rich? Sophie pressed. I decided honesty was the best approach. We have enough money that we could buy a mansion and a private jet if we wanted to. But we've chosen to live the same way we always have, because we like our life and our community. Both children absorbed this information with the adaptability that kids often show in the face of major revelations. Jake was already asking practical questions about whether this meant they could get better gaming equipment, while Sophie wanted to know if she could still attend the same school with her friends. Everything about your daily lives will stay the same, I assured them. The only difference is that some people might know that our family has resources we can use to help with community projects like improving the hospital. That evening, after the children were asleep, David and I had what felt like our first honest conversation since my financial revelation. The initial shock and anger had faded, replaced by a more complex mixture of admiration, concern, and uncertainty about our future relationship dynamics. I've been thinking about what you said about my assumptions, David began, about how I shut down your attempts to contribute to financial or professional discussions. And I think you're right. I did assume that your years at home meant you'd lost touch with professional-level thinking. I convinced myself that I was protecting you from embarrassment, but really I was protecting my own sense of being the expert in our relationship. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard from David in years, and I appreciated the acknowledgement even as I recognized how difficult it was for him to admit. What's concerning me now, he continued, is how we move forward from here. Tomorrow night, you're going to be recognized as one of the most influential people in our community. People will want your opinion on regional development, healthcare policy, education funding, all kinds of issues where your financial resources give you significant influence. Does that worry you? It worries me that I don't know what you want our partnership to look like going forward. Are you planning to build a public career around strategic philanthropy and community investment? Do you want to stay in Millbrook Heights? Or are you thinking about moving somewhere that offers more opportunities for someone with your resources? These were valid questions that I'd been avoiding while focusing on the immediate challenge of revealing my secret. My emergence as a major healthcare investor would necessarily create opportunities and obligations that didn't exist in my previous life as a quietly wealthy housewife. I'm not interested in becoming a full-time public figure, I said, but I do want to use these resources to address problems that matter to me. Healthcare access, education technology, community development projects that can make a real difference for families like ours. And you want to do that from here, maintaining our current life with some modifications, rather than moving to Seattle or San Francisco, where the investment opportunities might be more significant. David, I've built this wealth while living exactly the life we have now. I don't need to change our geographic location or social community to continue being successful. But I do need you to see me as a partner whose capabilities complement yours, rather than as a dependent whose limitations require your management. I'm beginning to understand that, David said quietly. It's going to take some adjustment, but I'm beginning to understand that. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable clarity, the kind of crisp Pacific Northwest night where the mountains seemed close enough to touch, and the city lights reflected perfectly off the sound. David and I drove to Pine Valley Medical Center in comfortable silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about how the evening would change our lives and relationship. The hospital's main conference room was packed beyond capacity, with additional chairs set up in the hallway and a live video feed broadcasting to other rooms in the building. Local media representatives occupied the front row, their cameras and recording equipment creating an atmosphere of anticipation that made this feel more like a major political announcement than a healthcare funding discussion. Dr. Vance had prepared meticulously for the presentation, with detailed charts showing Pine Valley's current capabilities, projected improvements, and long-term strategic vision for becoming a regional leader in medical technology and patient care innovation. The financial projections demonstrated how the $35 million investment would generate sustained improvements in healthcare access, treatment outcomes, and economic development for the entire region. This partnership represents more than just capital investment, Dr. Vance explained to the assembled crowd. It represents a vision for healthcare innovation that combines cutting-edge technology with community-centered care delivery. Our strategic partner brings not only financial resources but also expertise in technology integration and system optimization that will help us implement these improvements more effectively than traditional funding models would allow. David was seated in the third row with other hospital department heads, occasionally catching my eye with expressions that mixed pride and nervousness. I could see him trying to gauge how his colleagues were responding to the presentation, probably wondering how they'd react when they learned the mysterious investor was his previously dismissed wife. Before we discuss the specific details of our capital improvement plans, Dr. Vance continued, I want to introduce our investment partner, someone who has chosen to step forward at this critical moment for our community's healthcare future. Claire Henderson has built a remarkable track record of successful technology investment over the past several years, and her commitment to Pine Valley Medical Center reflects both her financial capabilities and her vision for healthcare innovation. The applause was polite but confused as I stood and walked to the front of the room. I could see people looking around, trying to place me in their mental categories of local wealthy families or prominent business leaders. Several hospital staff members recognized me as David's wife, and their expressions shifted from curiosity to bewilderment. Thank you, Dr. Vance, I began, feeling surprisingly calm despite the significance of the moment. I'm excited to discuss this partnership because it represents exactly the kind of strategic investment that can transform community healthcare delivery while generating sustainable value for all stakeholders. I'd prepared a 20-minute presentation that walked through my investment philosophy, my analysis of regional healthcare challenges, and my specific vision for how Pine Valley could become a model for other medium-sized medical centers facing similar modernization needs. Rather than focusing on the amount of money involved, I emphasized the strategic thinking behind the partnership and the measurable outcomes we expected to achieve. Healthcare technology integration isn't just about buying expensive equipment, I explained, displaying charts that showed how systematic technology adoption could improve both patient outcomes and operational efficiency. It's about creating workflows and systems that leverage innovation to deliver better care more efficiently. That requires understanding both the technological possibilities and the practical realities of healthcare delivery. The audience was following my presentation with increasing attention, clearly impressed by the depth of analysis and strategic vision I was presenting. But I could also see confusion on many faces as people tried to reconcile the sophisticated healthcare investor on stage with their previous understanding of me as David's supportive but unremarkable wife. The $35 million investment we're announcing tonight will fund comprehensive technology upgrades, facility expansion, and staff development programs over the next 5 years, I continued. But more importantly, it will establish Pine Valley as a regional leader in healthcare innovation, attracting additional investment and top medical talent that will benefit our entire community for decades to come. When I finished the formal presentation, Dr. Vance opened the floor for questions. The first few were technical inquiries about implementation timelines and performance metrics, which I answered with the kind of detailed knowledge that demonstrated serious preparation and expertise. Then Margaret Reynolds, the surgery chief's wife who'd always treated me with polite condescension at social events, raised her hand. "Claire, I think many of us are surprised to learn about your background in healthcare investment. Can you help us understand how you developed this expertise?" "I've been actively investing in technology companies for several years, with a particular focus on healthcare innovation startups," I replied. "My background includes both technical education and practical experience evaluating emerging technologies for investment potential. And this investment activity has been successful enough to fund a $35 million commitment." "Yes, quite successful." Dr. Martinez asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Claire, I believe you're married to David Henderson, who works in our budget analysis department. Has David been involved in developing this investment strategy?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The opportunity to address the elephant in the room without unnecessarily embarrassing David or creating awkward professional dynamics. "David has been learning about the full scope of my investment activities at the same time as everyone else," I said honestly. "I've maintained a deliberately private profile while building this portfolio, and we're both excited about the opportunity to use these resources to benefit our community's healthcare infrastructure." I could see people processing this information, realizing that David had been unaware of his wife's financial capabilities while working daily on hospital budget constraints that my resources could easily address. But rather than judgment, I saw mostly amazement and perhaps new respect for David's apparent good fortune in being married to someone whose capabilities exceeded everyone's expectations. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from regulatory compliance to long-term strategic planning. Each answer demonstrated that this wasn't a wealthy person's charitable whim, but a carefully considered investment strategy based on detailed analysis and clear performance objectives. As the formal meeting concluded and people began mingling over refreshments, I found myself surrounded by community leaders, medical staff, and local business owners who wanted to understand more about my investment approach and future plans. The conversations were respectful and genuinely curious rather than suspicious or resentful. David approached as I was finishing a discussion with the mayor about potential collaboration on broader community development projects. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "Claire, I've never seen you command a room like that. The level of respect and attention you generated was remarkable." "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciating his support. "I need to apologize for something," David continued. "When Patricia mentioned your potential interest in strategic philanthropy, I told her you wouldn't have relevant expertise. I was protecting what I thought was your reputation, but actually I was limiting what people could learn from you." "I know, and I appreciate you acknowledging that. Going forward, I want to be the husband who supports your professional activities rather than the one who explains your limitations to other people." Over the following weeks, the transformation in our community relationships was remarkable. People who'd previously seen me as David's pleasant but unremarkable wife began seeking my opinion on regional development issues, education funding strategies, and technology investment opportunities. My phone rang constantly with requests for meetings, speaking engagements, and board positions with local organizations. The media coverage was extensive but respectful, focusing on the innovative funding model and strategic vision rather than the personal dynamics of a housewife's secret wealth. Several articles portrayed our story as an example of how unconventional partnerships could address community challenges more effectively than traditional funding approaches. Most importantly, David and I began developing a new relationship dynamic based on mutual respect for each other's capabilities rather than assumed limitations. He brought his detailed understanding of healthcare operations and community needs, while I contributed strategic thinking and financial resources that could turn good ideas into implemented solutions. 3 months after the public announcement, we were having dinner at the Sterling restaurant when David raised his wine glass in a toast. "To discovering that the person you married is even more remarkable than you initially realized." "To partnerships that evolve," I replied, clinking my glass against his. and to the fact that sometimes the most transformative revelations happen right under your nose. As we sat in the restaurant where David had once dismissed me as just a housewife, I reflected on how completely our roles had reversed. The woman he'd condescended to was now recognized as one of the most influential people in our region, while his own professional identity had evolved from budget-conscious administrator to strategic partner of a major healthcare investor. The $52 million had been important, but the real transformation was in how we saw each other and ourselves. David had learned that his assumptions about my limitations said more about his own insecurities than my actual capabilities. I'd learned that hiding my success to protect his ego had diminished both of us. Our marriage wasn't the same as it had been before my revelation, but it was stronger because it was finally based on truth rather than comfortable deceptions. David had stopped trying to make me smaller to maintain his sense of superiority, and I'd stopped pretending to be less capable to preserve domestic harmony. 6 months later, Pine Valley Medical Center was featured in a national healthcare magazine as an example of innovative public-private partnerships in community medicine. The article mentioned that the $35 million investment had already attracted additional funding from state and federal sources, creating a total modernization budget that exceeded $60 million. But the detail that made me proudest was buried in the middle of the article. The Henderson Healthcare Innovation Fund has established a model for strategic philanthropy that combines significant capital investment with hands-on expertise and technology integration, creating sustainable improvements that benefit both patients and operational efficiency. That evening, I found David reading the article at our kitchen table, the same place where he'd once lectured me about my limited understanding of financial complexity. "Henderson Healthcare Innovation Fund," he said, looking up at me with genuine admiration. "That has a nice ring to it." "It does," I agreed, thinking about the additional healthcare systems that had approached me about similar partnerships, and the education technology initiatives I was considering for the school district. "Any regrets about giving up your secret life as a quietly wealthy housewife?" I considered the question seriously. My days were now filled with board meetings, investment analysis, and strategic planning sessions that would have been impossible to hide from David or our community. The private satisfaction of building wealth in secret had been replaced by the public responsibility of deploying that wealth effectively. "No regrets," I said finally. "But I do miss the simplicity sometimes. Well, if it helps, I promise never again to dismiss your understanding of complex financial matters. And I promise never again to build a $50 million portfolio without mentioning it." We laughed, and for the first time in years it felt like we were genuinely partners, rather than people playing assigned roles in a marriage that had outlived its original assumptions. The housewife who'd been dismissed as intellectually limited had become a recognized expert in healthcare investment strategy. The husband who'd positioned himself as the financial authority had learned to respect expertise he'd never known existed. Our story had become public inspiration for people reassessing their own assumptions about capability and potential. But privately, it was simply the story of two people who'd finally learned to see each other clearly, without the comfortable lies that had once made their relationship feel safe but ultimately limited both of their possibilities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.